I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. What is wrong with this picture? And it's not the picture of Karen Vergada. Now, what I find interesting about serial killer cases often has almost nothing to do with the serial killers themselves. They're often vacuous, empty people or their unfortunate victims. I don't see a lot of intrigue in that area unless you are interested or entertained in grotesqueries. If you like to be shocked by what one human being can do to several other human beings. Instead, it's the fabric that these cases emerge from that I find fascinating. One aspect that is common to more than a few serial killer cases is how long it took the public to care about the number of victims piling up. And I think that is a very real subtext to this story, because I think it's fair to suggest maybe people cared about 11 sets of human remains on Gilgo Beach, but did they care enough? A former analyst from Britain's New Scotland Yard highlighted a story relevant to this line of thinking that came out yesterday in the Washington Post. I think I have a totally different interpretation to Laura Richards. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this episode worthwhile, useful analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So a few things I noticed just right off the bat was the way all of this has been presented. The officers, the law enforcement folks gathered in kind of almost like a photo op, and I mean it has been many photo ops, dressed in suits and ties, and quite a lot of pageantry just around that, with some reporters saying afterwards, what is that all about? You know, you haven't really told us anything. Well, part of it was giving the folks that are on camera exposure, airtime. Did you notice that? Did you notice the number of individuals kind of in the background and how they were dressed and that whole sort of setup? And if you compare that to so many of the other press conferences we've dealt with, where you don't have the district attorney briefing the press, you tend to have an officer, a detective, someone really affiliated with the police force. You don't really have the prosecutor taking the floor, as it were. According to the Washington Post, quote, a decade after the discovery of 11 bodies near Gilgo Beach sparked a search for one of America's most elusive serial killers, a Long Island district attorney's office turned its attention to an aging former police officer. Detectives, meanwhile, felt that the district attorney at the time, Tim Sini, was forcing them to investigate leads they had already ruled out, while ratcheting up pressure, and this is important, to solve the case before his 2021 re-election bid. The tension grew so high that at Sini's urging, the case's longtime lead detective was removed. End quote. Well, we know they failed to solve the case before Sini's re-election, although they did find a suspect. They did narrow it down to Rex Uerman within 6 weeks of analyzing old cell phone data. And I see some of you guys are saying, I didn't know they had cell phones in that time. Well, obviously they did. You can't analyze old cell phone data without there being cell phones. And there were cell phones in that time. Remember, we're dealing with New York, Manhattan, Long Island, one of those areas in the world that tends to get new things before a lot of other places in the world. Now, when Laura Richards talks about corruption and male egos, I don't know. And then she also says it's women who pay the price. I kind of get a sexist feeling about that. I get a feeling it's women who blame men for being the way they are. And so that's the problem in this case. I don't think that's very helpful. I don't think it's helpful antagonizing men in general, accusing men as a gender, right? I don't think that's helpful. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's fortunate that politics at a fairly high level played such a big role in reopening this investigation. You could argue that if men weren't men in this case, that this case wouldn't have been investigated. I mean, you could say, well, the woman in this case should have done everything, you know, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, but they were doing everything that they could do. So the other side of this of that coin is that many of the victims in this case have been forgotten by their own friends and families. It's thanks to a Suffolk County District Attorney wanting to score some political points that this case got another look at. I'm not saying that that is good. I'm not saying that that is a good backstory to this. I am saying it's fortunate that it happened, because if it didn't happen, would this case have been solved? And you might say, well, in an ideal world, surely they would just investigate all cases and solve all cases, but that's not what happens. That's not what happens in the world. So I agree. I think it's unfortunate that it wasn't purely the pursuit of justice that got the investigation back on track. But we've got to be realistic about reality as well. And I think one of the things that comes through in this case is the perpetrator, I believe, had an awareness of the world's attitude to the have-nots, the losers, the bungled and the botched. The way, if this person was wandering around Manhattan, he would know what sort of people get attention and where the public and society cares about certain people, and what sort of people can fall off the radar and be forgotten. I think he had personally experienced that. And so I think that was part of how he chose his victims, was he chose people, probably when he spoke to them, he asked them about their relationships with family and how long they'd been an escort and why they'd become an escort and things like that, because he knew when they disappeared, no one would really care in several cases. And although there's some exceptions, 11 people died and disappeared in the story, and it seems it's taken, putting it all together, 26 years to basically reach this point, which is as long as the JonBenet Ramsey case. What I think the Long Island serial killer case demonstrates is how often cases are actually solved based on the ordinary intelligence gathered during the original investigation. That's the part that really excites me. I find it intriguing why this investigation kind of got cold. Basically, I think just because not enough people cared in the area, in the community, right? I'm not saying no one cared, just that not enough people cared. But the thing that is just so fascinating is they basically rediscovered information that they had all along. And you find that is the case so often. You know, when I went and did a reinvestigation myself of the JonBenet Ramsey case and of the Madeleine McCann case, you're basically doing the same thing. You're finding information that was there all along. And a pivotal lead in this case that was basically enough to crack the case was mishandled. According to the article, there was a bail application that prosecutors filed following Uhrman's arrest, and in that bail application, witnesses gave police a detailed description of the man who visited Costello, one of the four women, one of those four bodies found by the police in 2010, right? And that was shortly, that statement that made by witnesses, it was something they witnessed shortly before her disappearance. And the witness report in the document describes an ogre standing more than 6 feet 4 inches tall and driving a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. Now, we know all this, but what we've got here is the description of an oversized man and a particular vehicle. Now, how hard would that be to find in Massapequa Park? If you just had to walk around some of the neighborhoods and say, you know, is there a really big dude that lives somewhere around here? I don't think there would be too many people who wouldn't know. and it's not a very big area. And then a Chevrolet Avalanche, you would just need to drive around the neighborhoods and spot one of them. And so Tierney, the district attorney, confirmed in an interview that police had obtained the witness descriptions of the suspect's appearance and his truck around the time Costello's body was found in December 2010. So you can see that this case could fairly easily have been solved 13 years ago. And we saw exactly the same thing with the Delphi case. Cops had spoken to a man who said he was on the bridge on the day and near the time that the crimes were committed. Like writing a book or a script, sometimes it takes a fresh pair of eyes to go through it and appreciate the narrative for what it is, and also to find an elusive mistake or a loose end that needs to be tied up. And I think it also relies on the competence of certain detectives. Some detectives have what it takes to be a detective. They're detail-oriented, they remember details, they're good at pattern recognition, they can see subtlety where other people don't see it. And sometimes you need that person. You don't need a fresh pair of eyes, you need someone with a sharp pair of eyes. Not everyone has a sharp pair of eyes in the noise, in the muddle, in the maelstrom of lots of information coming out. How do you determine one statement over another? Well, it takes that sense of gut and that sense of intelligence, sparkling intelligence. In any event, according to the article, quote, amid that squabbling, a decade-old witness tip concerning the model of a pickup truck linked to the suspect killer went ignored. Last month, under the new district attorney who unseated Sini, that tip finally led to the arrest of another suspect who lived blocks away from the ex-officer. And he was Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect who was charged with 3 of the murders and under suspicion of another. So basically you had people focused on someone, and there was a lot of political intrigue and a lot of score settling, and so people were fixated on a particular individual, which made them blind to what was really going on. So the number 5 clue we all missed is really that the Heuermann case was about tunnel vision for a really long time. In other words, how do you potentially get away with murder for 26 years? Well, tunnel vision. You have tunnel vision in the John Benet Ramsey case. You have tunnel vision in the Madeleine McCann case. In both those cases, we're not going to talk about this and we're not going to talk about that. Well, then you've got tunnel vision. Tunnel vision can be bad, and it was in this instance when you gravitate to something or someone by mistake, and then the soldier mindset kicks in, and the investigation fixates and then stalls altogether. You defend your fortress. Tunnel vision, if it occurs at just the right time, and if it's the right tunnel, such as what happened here, examining relevant samples of cell phone data, looking at the right witness statement, right, that can become the proper focus an investigation needs. The Long Island serial killer case illustrates our common selfishness as people, in my opinion. Heuermann's family just want to be allowed to get back to their lives. Who wouldn't? The neighbors are concerned property prices in the area are going to fall. The media and social media want to get their pounds of content flesh. But where are the family members of the 11 victims connected to or associated with this case, campaigning for justice, making statements, in the media related to this case? I'm speaking in a general sense, but it was in this sense that the killer was quite clever. He knew what he wanted. What he also knew is if certain people disappeared, no one would really miss them. And for 11 years, no one really has, perhaps with the exception of Costello and Gilbert. I must say that was very brazen to go into the situation where there were witnesses, be dissuaded, come back later, and then kill the person anyway. That was definitely pretty crazy in a sense. But what does all of this say about us? The Great Gatsby is about the rise of an incorruptible dream within the corruption of great wealth and influence in Long Island and New York. In true crime, I must say, I see so many creators who are corrupted by their own influence. they seem less interested in the reality of the case than how a particular reality can benefit them. And the crazy part is their audiences get onto that same bandwagon. Their audiences also want a particular outcome. And now we're having situations where people are talking about multiple serial killers in the Gilgo Beach area, where people talk about the photo of Karen Vergada and saying she looks like a man. This is what makes investigations really difficult, is people's proclivity to want to believe whatever they want to believe, and that is what makes it so hard to determine reality. What is authentic in a world that is so given to bias? You know, our own biases. And basically, your own bias is the beginning of corruption. It's the beginning of how you distort reality to suit your own needs. And how different is that from someone who's looking at pornography and then choosing to take that corruption into the real world? So let me ask you a question. Does this idea of fighting injustice still mean something if the fight itself is corrupt or corruptible? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.